Now today we have a very interesting Patreon question. Basically, was the Afrika Korps worth it? Now first we need to take a look at the bigger picture here, because we're talking about the Mediterranean versus North Africa. Because to a certain degree we need to look at the whole Mediterranean and not just at the North Africa campaign, which was fought in Tunisia, Libya and the other parts. And basically in North Africa it was not so much a desert warfare or a war about North Africa, it was basically a war about coastal roads, ports and airfields, which were rather few. So it was actually a very limited amount of space they were fought for. So, and additionally, since it's the whole Mediterranean, it's also linked to the Balkans. For instance, when the British deployed troops to Greece, they pulled them out of North Africa. So Wavell and Churchill, there was some problems. So everything is linked into it, and also additionally it's also linked to Spain being in the Mediterranean, of course, with Gibraltar and everything, and Gibraltar entering, and Suez and Battle of Crete. And yeah, it's a big, we need to look at the Mediterranean, else North Africa or the Afrika Korps makes very little sense. And the Mediterranean is viewed by many as an affair for the Brits, because a lot of supplies and everything passes through the Mediterranean. Now, of course, once Italy entered the war and the Italian Navy was a major threat, this artery was basically interrupted. And many ships, especially the civilian ships, were sent around the Cape of Good Hope around Africa. This added around 4,500 miles to the whole trip, which of course makes everything, increases wear and tear, the turnaround time and everything. So there are many problems with it. So the British decided, okay, we only send in heavily armed convoys and warships, but no more unescorted convoys. And when in June 1943 the Mediterranean was basically reopened again, Dönitz noted that around 2 million tons of ship space was now added again to the British capacity, or that they get more through each month. And now already in 1944, 800 convoys with about 12,000 ships in total passed through the Mediterranean. As you can see, very important for supplies and the whole resources and everything. So in this case, the Mediterranean is far more important than the few dunes in North Africa, because there the fight was about the ports and the airfields and everything there. So, and if we also take a look at the losses the British faced, so in 1941 to 1942 they lost 2 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship and 13 major combat vessels. So they paid a heavy price for this. So, and they invested for a certain reason. But now let's get back to the Afrika Korps. Now, basically the first discussion comes up if there should be an Afrika Korps or something in the Mediterranean is in summer 1940. France is defeated, but Great Britain continues to fight. And this of course is now the question, what are we gonna do? Is it gonna happen the Battle of Britain, or maybe focus on the Mediterranean to weaken the British there so that they might finally surrender? And basically the call back then is no, but in winter 1940, Italy needs help. Mussolini says, okay, we're threatened in North Africa, we're losing our colonies there, the British beat us back, Hitler, I need help. So, and here's the thing. Hitler looked at it and said, militarily, there's no need to do this. But if Italy loses in North Africa, they might drop out of the war, and this is a problem. So the Afrika Korps was a political necessity, but not seen as a military one. Of course, there's another issue. If there are bases in North Africa and everything, and they aren't threatened, the oil in Romania gets threatened, and also, of course, Italy from bombers. So there's also this reason. And additionally, the Mediterranean coast of France is also now needs to be defended as well once the North African coastline is under control of the Allies. And when Operation Torch launches in the end of 1942, the Germans launch a Case Anton, which basically is the occupation of parts of Fiji, France on the Mediterranean coast. So, well, as you can see, it's actually quite interesting that some aspects need to be considered, because later on you see, okay, the action was actually followed by this. So initially, since it was mainly fought as a defensive action, the Afrika Korps, it wasn't called a Panzersperrverband, basically an armored blocking force. And they wanted to send in the end also, but more, sent the 5th Leichte Division. Now, Leichte Divisionen were basically panzer divisions. I think they only had 1 battalion or very few panzers and some motorized infantry. So basically they were light panzer divisions, very light panzer divisions. So they already realized in Poland and France they don't have enough fighting power usually. So as you can see, they don't want to send a complete combat division, but one more or less a lightweight division. And it's very interesting here that the estimated shipping time was 42 days from the Kriegsmarine to ship this rather small division over there. So this is especially interesting for people who play Hearts of Iron 3, because you can ship a division in basically a few days. And now the whole question is, was the Afrika Korps actually the center of the fighting for the Mediterranean, or was it just a rear guard? Because for a long time many people thought, okay, the Afrika Korps, this is the main thing where everything goes on. But once the Afrika Korps is defeated, the battle in the Mediterranean doesn't end yet. So this is very interesting. And if we look now at the Navy's view, the Kriegsmarine and the Royal Navy both saw the Mediterranean as a killing zone for the other one. So they wanted to kill as many of their ships and forces there without losing too much of their own. Didn't really work out that well. And what's very interesting is, we are talking all about Rommel and Africa usually. But if we look at the Luftwaffe, it gets really interesting. Because in 1943, a major amount of troops get deployed after Torch in end of 1942. And if we look at the losses and the deployment, it's quite insane. There are less than 5% of armored divisions there deployed. But almost 40% of all German bombers are deployed in the Mediterranean at this point. So as you can see, we're always talking about Rommel, but nobody talks about the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean, although they have 40% of the bombers there, which clearly were missed on the Eastern Front. And there were some planes were deployed during the height of the Battle of Stalingrad, were deployed to the Mediterranean, which also is the whole problem with where you set your focus, your Schwerpunkt on the strategic level, because the Mediterranean was always neglected to a certain degree, but to secure it, they spent a lot of resources. And also another very important aspect for the Allies was that you can see that the Mediterranean or North Africa was basically a learning area for the US forces. There's a very interesting quote here. And basically Eisenhower also noted this was a training ground, or I think he noted that the officers needed a blooding, or that the whole US forces needed a blooding in North Africa several months to get basically into the war. Now, to answer the question, I personally think it was not worth it. And the main issue here was there was no real strategy. It was basically, okay, let's hold the Italian front. And then once Rommel started to attack and win several victories, he said, okay, we try to win now there. We try to drive them back. So it's basically, if you say, okay, we just want to hold off the British that they don't crush the Italians, then maybe just do this and skip the other part. Or if you want to go, okay, let's roll over and take everything over, yeah, then let's secure enough forces to do this. And this is the main issue. There was no clear strategy, no clear goal here. So why do we send these guys? What should they achieve? And what are the limits of their actions? So Germany always deployed mainly in a piecemeal fashion. This is especially reflected if you look at the deployment of the Luftwaffe in 1943. I mean, almost 40% of all bombers. So also, yeah, then the other issue, of course, was the logistics, of course, to a certain degree, because the ports they had in North Africa initially were rather not well developed, and there were only very few. Tobruk, for instance, they had to capture that first and everything. So this is also, it gets complicated here, because if you talk with many people about this, it's quite complicated at what timeline you're talking. And for instance, Tunis originally didn't send the troops there because it was Vichy France, but in the end they used it as a port and was far closer. So if they would have deployed initially to Tunis, maybe they would have something different. And it's also very important for the experience that the US and also the British forces could gain in North Africa. And the Germans also spent quite a lot of equipment. I mean, they sent Tigers there, and the Panzerkampfwagen 4 with the long barrel 75mm gun, and many other equipment that should have probably not be deployed for defensive action, for holding action, for a Panzersperrverband. So this is the whole issue with the Mediterranean, that it was not a very well thought out strategy. Now, of course, maybe if you take a hard look and do whole calculations of losses, fuel, oil and resources and manpower deployed and everything, maybe there's a calculation where actually the Allies spent way more than the Axis forces, although I doubt that. And also there's of course the balance of how much, because the US forces usually could afford way more resources, way more tanks, way more oil to lose than the others. But if you look what got lost in transport to the Afrika Korps and supplies and everything, it's just staggering how much they lost just get over the few barrels of oil and everything, and then they supplied them from the air and everything. Which also, of course, raises the question, which one of my Patreon notes a few times, that if the Axis would have deployed heavily in 1940 or also in 1941, what they did later on in 1943, maybe they could have won actually the war in North Africa. Of course, the question is then what to do next, because if you drive the British out of Egypt and you close the Suez Canal, well, the civilian traffic wasn't going through there anyway. And the Middle East, although is today known very much for all the oil, but in the Second World War it wasn't not that important in terms of oil. So the whole Mediterranean, well, I would say Afrika Korps was definitely not worth it, not the way it was handled and with the overall lack of strategy. So I hope this answered your question and gave you also a bit of a better insight and a better understanding of the whole Mediterranean campaign. I certainly learned a lot by reading on this. So, thank you for watching and see you next time.